OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Final Chapter 17. A Together Dream. The sense of motion ceased. Monarch and Leona tried to hold their consciousnesses as steady as possible, but even then there was a momentary mental blackout. It lasted barely a second. Then there was a jumble of half-formed images as their dream sight began to operate. At first Monarch just saw shapes, but gradually they gained object status, though everything was gray. All of his other dream senses operated fully, though, so that he stood solidly enough in the corner of the landing room. Beside him, Leona gasped. She saw color brilliantly. Testing, she tried to smell the air. Nothing. She wasn't quite focused yet, she thought. Preparing to take a few steps, she rose in the air several tumbling feet. Monarch smiled, and she floated down, apologizing. "I'm sorry. I'm all right now. Can you tell anything?" They stood quietly, staring. Gradually, the contents of the room became clear. There were several people seated at a table. "If we're right, our aspects should be here. We'd be attracted to them," Monarch said. And as he uttered those words, his consciousness fluctuated, surged, and pulled him toward a man who was speaking. Monarch stood invisibly beside the man's chair, and as he did, that individual's mind opened up to him, almost as if it was his own. It wasn't, of course. Yet the same sense of familiarity and strangeness was extremely intoxicating. "Watch yourself," Leona cried. "Don't double in on yourself and find him that way, Monarch." Monarch heard and didn't hear. Why, he wondered, did this man and this room seem so familiar, so intimate? As if he'd been here, and not in dreams, before. Before he could even begin to answer his own question, Monarch almost panicked at some assaulting audio data suddenly blotted out everything else. The thunderous, throbbing rush of sound was followed by squeaking, squealing higher frequencies that hurt Monarch's dream ears, even while the rhythm of the two kinds of sound seemed to be translated into an unwieldy anxiety. For a moment the sound seemed everywhere. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Dazed, Monarch opened his dream eyes again. Leona was staring at him incredulously. She'd obviously heard the noises too. There was still some static, but gradually, as they stood invisibly in the room, Monarch and Leona identified the specific sounds of the persons speaking. The earlier barrage had propelled Monarch's consciousness away from the man who so intrigued him. And now Monarch made cautious attempts to establish some kind of rapport. "I'm Monarch," he said mentally. "I'm Monarch," John Window said, seated in George's 20th century kitchen. "Again?" George asked, grinning. "I've always been Monarch," Monarch replied mentally with astonishment. And again John Window spoke his words. "There's some other consciousnesses here," Seven said. "Will you cut that out? You're as bad as Window. It's positively spooky, George said, quickly finishing a beer. He's a split personality. Seven turned to Window and said, "If you're really Monarch, then you must know what the codicils are." Silence. Monarch was so excited that he didn't dare speak, not even mentally. Beside him, Leona said, "One of them isn't really physical. Look, that body doesn't have a history. It's flat at this level. Be careful." The room and other people seem real, though. Just then, the dreadful combination of sounds set up a new uproar, knocking all thoughts from Monarch's head. This time the volume was greater than before, and the sounds rattled around Monarch's dream head like sharp rocks. Then once again, unaccountably, the noises stopped. One man was saying, "You can't hear a thing with that goddamn traffic." Monarch was able to make out the words. He grinned weakly at Leona. Traffic? So that's what traffic was. George closed the window. Seven really wanted to get out of his body so that he could deal with this new group of events, but he didn't dare. Again he said gently, "If you're Monarch, we know the codicils are in your world, in your probability. But in our probability, in your past, we haven't put them there yet. Do you understand?" Monarch tried to concentrate on the words he heard, but the floor of his consciousness kept shifting. There was only one thing to do, he thought, if he could manage it. "Bail me out if I need it," he told Leona mentally. And in the next moment he let his consciousness lean closer and closer to Windows. At a certain psychological level, a subjective attraction took over, and Monarch felt as if he went twirling through worlds of emotions and sensations until finally he opened his eyes to look upon this strange room from Windows' viewpoint. Yet he was still himself, and this body's senses kept the sense data clear and untangled. "I think I understand," he said, with Windows' voice. But for a moment Monarch could say nothing more as he tried to orient himself. Windows' consciousness was truly spacious. Monarch symbolically experienced the aspects of Windows' personality as separate large rooms at whose doorways he stood staring. The 20th century Window faced his own time, that was for certain. But in a reflection form, Monarch saw his own personality in still another room, where his own characteristics operated as Windows' unconscious. Could that be? He wondered. And between the two stood Windows' Christ. Really astonished, but understanding, Monarch through Windows spoke out. "Window can heal. I understand now. Before the codicils, you didn't realize that you could heal yourselves or others without medicine." Monarch was overwhelmed with compassion as Window's memory images glowed in his own consciousness. Window as a child being punished for healing a cat, the child trying to use his abilities against the greatest constraints. "Oh!" Monarch cried, with half exasperation. Window identified with Christ because gods at least could heal, and Window wouldn't have to bear the guilt. Monarch felt woozy. He struggled to control his own subjective stance. "It's all right. I'm here helping," Leona said. "Hell, that makes sense," said George, wiping the perspiration from his face. "It makes sense, you know." And then to Seven, But why does he have to go into one of those damn trances to find out? Be quiet, George, Seven whispered. You'll distract him. George? Monarch asked incredulously. You're George? The George? George was always embarrassed for Window when he spoke for Christ or Monarch. He couldn't look him in the face. Grinning, he said, The George? Well, I'm George anyhow. I'm deeply honored, Monarch said. He is the George, Leona whispered mentally. And he isn't. I can tell. Something's distorted. And then, obviously, you aren't trying to steal the codicils, Monarch replied to George with relief. Seven interrupted. We're trying to make sure that the codicils do appear in your time. You must be dream travelers. I sense someone else with Monarch. But Monarch gasped. The room walls were fading, the objects falling away into images, and the images into shapes that gently disintegrated. Leona, are you with me? He called mentally. He felt her presence, even as his body called him back to the bedroom at the museum. For an instant, all expression vanished from John Window's eyes as Monarch's consciousness fled from his counterpart's mind, and Window felt as if he'd suddenly wakened in a new world without knowing which world it was. But no, he thought, the world was the same. George, Seven, and Diggs were still staring at him, only he had changed. Christ was gone. Almost incredulous, Window rummaged through his inner awareness. The paranoid Christ was nowhere to be found. I'm not Christ anymore, he said. He's gone for good. Odd, George just muttered, Yeah, because there was no doubt about it. Before his eyes, Window was turning into someone else, or into himself. Even Seven gasped. Window's eyes seemed to go click, 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 as if changing or reflecting several different focuses before settling on one. And that one focus represented Window's characteristics reshuffled, put together in a new way. Then Window's eyes were calm, resolute, sure of themselves, no longer sifting or listing or frightened. The process hardly took a moment. When Window's eyes started their transformation, Gregory Diggs had started to say, My God, and by the time he'd completed the 2 words, the process was over. But as if in response, innumerable vital yet individual minute alterations took place in John Window's posture, manner, in his lips and nose and ears, as if the man called Window was suddenly put together right, and all of the tensions and struggles that divided him had been resolved. Quite simply, George, Diggs, and Seven all knew that Window was now completely sane, whether or not he had been before, and that this man was Window, regardless of the status of Christ or Monarch. What's going on? Diggs asked, staring. What do you mean, you're not Christ anymore? Ever? You can't heal? Window grinned, shaking his head from one side to the other with relief. I know what I experienced, he said. You'll have to fill me in on what I don't remember. But anyhow, when it was over, I knew that I've always been able to heal, and that unconsciously I formed the Christ personality to make the whole thing reasonable, as crazy as it seemed to others. but there's so much more. 7 felt Cyprus somewhere at the outskirts of his own consciousness, and it seemed to him that there was psychological motion all about, so powerful that he wanted to join it and leave his body, which he kept forgetting now and then, not that anyone noticed. He said quickly, "Tell us what happened as far as you're concerned, Window." Window grinned again. "I'm just getting used to being myself," he answered. "And what I'm going to say does sound crazy, I guess, but I know it isn't." George shook his own head. He knew that whatever Window would say was true, but how did he know? Window began, "I used to speak for a personality called Monarch, as you know. Well, suddenly that consciousness and mine merged. I knew Monarch's life, and he knew mine. But his was a world that makes ours really look sick. I've never been so happy in my life as when I glimpsed pictures of that world through his mental images. And his world was based on completely different ideas than ours." While OverSoul 7 was so concerned with finding the codicils, the words "the codicils" kept sounding through Josephine's mind. She sensed some odd familiarity, as if she herself had run across that particular phrase in some significant way before. That is, she thought, the words meant appendages to a will. Yet suppose in this connotation they meant appendixes to the will.
To man's will?
With no particular destination in mind, she walked up the stairs to her small study and found herself examining the piles of books stacked so neatly on the bookshelves. "The codicils," she muttered anxiously. As if by themselves, her hands began rummaging through the books, fingering the pages. Yet she had the odd feeling that her fingers knew what they were doing, that she had in mind some particular goal beyond her conscious knowing. There was a window above the bookcase. She glanced up at it, and as if the window were a clue, suddenly her fingers flew nervously past book after book, sorting through pages. She'd never felt such a strange pressure in her mind, in her fingers, in her entire being. Then the moment came that she would always remember. She yelled out suddenly in triumph and exultation as she found the phrase, the particular phrase, that was so vital. It was in an old book, Psychic Politics, by a Jane Roberts, written many years before. There it was, the blueprint for mankind's future, the blueprint that she was now completely sure was also written in the tissues and cells of the species itself. She read quickly, triumphantly. Codicils. Alternate hypotheses as a base for private and public experience. Number 1. All of creation is sacred and alive, each part connected to each other part, and each communicating in a creative cooperative commerce in which the smallest and the largest are equally involved. Number 2. The physical senses present one unique version of reality, in which being is perceived in a particular dimensionalized sequence, built up through neurological patterning, and is the result of one kind of neurological focus. There are alternate neurological routes, biologically acceptable, and other sequences so far not chosen. Number 3. Our individual self-government and our political organizations are byproducts of sequential perception, and our exterior methods of communication set up patterns that correlate with and duplicate our synaptic behavior. We lock ourselves into certain structures of reality in this way. Number 4. Our sequential prejudged perception is inherently far more flexible than we recognize, however. There are half steps, other unperceived impulses, that leap the nerves too fast and too slow for our usual focus. Recognition of these can be learned and encouraged, bringing in perceptive data that will trigger changes in usual sense response, filling out potential sense spectra with which we are normally not familiar.
Number 5.
This greater possible sense spectrum includes increased perception of inner bodily reality in terms of cellular identity and behavior, automatic conscious control of bodily processes, and increased perception of exterior conditions as the usual senses become more vigorous. Our sight, for example, is not nearly as efficient as it could be. Nuances of color, texture, and depth could be expanded, and our entire visual area attain a brilliance presently considered exceptional or supernormal. Josephine's glance slid down the page. The codicils were followed by comments by the author. There was a paragraph called Comments on the Codicils. It seemed to apply to Codicil 1 and to the 5 codicils in general at the same time. She read the pertinent pages quickly and impatiently. Comments on the codicils. Acceptance of these first codicils would expand practical knowledge of the self, break down barriers that are the result of our prejudiced perception, and restructure personal, social, and political life. Concepts of the self and practical experience of the self must be broadened if the species is to develop its true potentials. Only an evolution of consciousness can alter the world view that appears to our official line of consciousness. Comment on Codicil 2. The next step is as important as the birth of Christianity was in the history of mankind. It will present a new structure for civilization to follow. Christianity represented the human psyche at a certain point, forming first inner patterns for development that then become exteriorized as myth, drama, and history, with the Jewish culture of the Talmud presenting the psyche's direction. The differences between Jewish and Christian tradition represented allied but different probabilities, one splitting off from the other, but united by common roots and actualized in the world to varying degrees. The traditional personified God concept represented the mass psyche's one ego development, the ego ruling the self as God ruled man, man dominant over the planet and the other species, as God was dominant over man, as opposed to the idea of mini-gods or the growth of a more multi-focused self with greater nature identification. Neurological patterning of the kind we now began with the early Old Testament Jews, known then as God's people, looking forward through time to a completely one ego-focused self. Before, neurological functioning was not as set, and in our world today some minority peoples and tribes still hold to those alternative neurological pulses. These will not appear to our measuring devices because we are literally blind to them. The Jewish prophets, however, utilized these alternate focuses of perception themselves, and were relatively unprejudiced neurologically. They were therefore able to perceive alternate visions of reality, yet their great work, while focusing the energy of an entire religion and leading to Christianity, also resulted in limiting man's potential perceptive area in important ways. The prophets were able to sense the potentials of the mass psyche, and their prophecies charted courses in time, projecting the Jewish religion into the future. The prophecies gave the people great strength precisely because they gave their religion a future in time, providing a thread of continuity and a certain immortality in earthly terms. The prophecies were psychic molds to be filled out in flesh. Some were fulfilled and some were not, but the unfulfilled ones were forgotten and served their purposes by providing alternate selections and directions. The prophecies ahead of time charted out a people's probable course, foreseeing the triumphs and disasters inherent in such an adventure through time. They provided psychic webworks, blueprints, and dramas, with living people stepping into the roles already outlined, but also improvising as they went along. These roles were valid, however, chosen in response to an inner reality that foresaw the shape that the living psyche
of the
people would take in time. But as a snake throws off old skin, the psyche throws off old patterns that have become rigid, and we need a new set of psychic blueprints to further extend the species into the future, replete with great deeds, heroes, and challenges. A new creative drama projected from the psyche into the three-dimensional arena. For now, we no longer view reality through original eyes, but through structures of beliefs that we have outgrown. These structures are simply meant to frame and organize experience, but we mistake the picture for the reality that it represents. We become neurologically frozen in that respect, forced to recognize the one sequential pattern of sense perceptions, so that we think that the one we've chosen is the only one possible. Comment on Codicil 3. Thus far, we've projected the unrecognized portions of our greater selfhood outward into God, religion, government, and exteriorized concepts. In this existence, selfhood is dependent upon sense perceptions, so that our neurological
prejudice
of rigid focus have limited our concepts of identity. When we do become aware of unofficial information coming through other than recognized channels, then it seems to come from not self or outside. A great deal of energy has been used to repress levels of selfhood and to project these into religions and nationalistic heroes and cultural organizations. Government and religion try to preserve the status quo, to preserve their own existences, not for political or religious reasons, but to preserve the official picture of the self around which they are formed. But the structured reality in which that kind of self can exist is breaking down. The official picture no longer fits or explains private experience which is growing out of it. There is a momentary rift between the inner psyche and its creations. Besides this, the experienced self is not the same through the ages. The experienced self is a psychic creation, responsive to exterior conditions which it creates as the psyche dives into the waters of experienced earthly selfhood. only a portion of the potential self is experienced, but different portions as intents and purposes change. It is possible, though, to actualize more of our potential. Comment on codicils 4 and 5. The answers and solutions lie in using levels of consciousness now considered eccentric or secondary. This includes far greater utilization of the dream states and altered conditions thus far thought to be exceptions of consciousness. These exceptions represent other kinds of focuses, greatly needed to broaden our concepts of the self and our experience of personal selfhood by increasing conceptualization, giving direct experience of alternate views, and bringing other kinds of data to bear upon the world we know. In the past, the attitudes surrounding such perceptions brought about their own difficulties. The perceptions are biologically acceptable, however, and will lead to a clearer relationship between mind and body. Josephine felt like crying with joy and relief. It was as if the codicils had always been in the back of her consciousness, about to be retrieved. And what about the book? She'd found it a year or so ago in a second-hand bookshop, and had never read through it. She had read those few pages, though, never recognizing their importance, and surely not realizing that they would one day change her life. Because her life was being changed. No doubt about it. She felt suddenly that she should return to George's at once. At the same time, Josephine felt some portion of her own mind reach outward in a new and wonderful fashion. She sat down in the one armchair, almost dazed. What was happening? She wondered, because a part of her consciousness already was at George's. That portion of her mind dimly saw the kitchen, and the name Leona started to appear in her mind in block letters and flashing lights. Now what could that mean? And as Josephine wondered, Leona in her dream body in George's kitchen sensed Josephine's presence. In her dream body, Leona cried out to Monarch, "I can almost sense still another person, a woman who is a counterpart of mine, a woman who possesses knowledge of the codicils. I'm not sure what is happening, but I know the codicils are safe. We can go home now. It's all right. The codicils are safe." Her consciousness fluctuated. She and Monarch joined their minds together at once again. They looked once more round the ancient kitchen, knowing that the codicils had been planted firmly back in time. The rhythms of mind travel reasserted themselves, and they started their mental journey home, satisfied, joyful, ready for the cinquentennial. In her study, Josephine picked up the book again and glanced at those significant paragraphs. And as she did, they flashed into Leona's mind, and Windows, and Monarch's, and into Gregory Diggs' mind, and to the minds of both George's, and into OverSoul 7's mind. But it was 7 alone who saw Cypress. She was smiling the most serene smile OverSoul 7 had ever seen. 7 was trying to keep track of everything at once. He was so excited and relieved that he could hardly speak. At the same time, Cypress said, "7, look here." And 7 saw the thin hand of George I begin scribbling on the paper of the old journal. And OverSoul 7 saw George's hand begin to write down those vital words, "The codicils." George I cried out, "Zounds! What luck! You'll never know, Seven whispered to George mentally. Goodbye, dear friend, at least for now. He grinned and added, It's been, a super relationship. You succeeded in your pursuits far better than you know. And Seven knew that it was all right, that everything was all right. Always had been all right. That it had only been their own anxieties and doubts that ever made it all seem wrong. They were all couched and safe, forever secure, forever jubilant at the heart of their own beings. There was never anything to be afraid of, if only they trusted the great sweet security that forever held the vitality of their beings, for they were all truly splendid, a part of a loving universe that cradled them forever in a safety and love literally beyond all comprehension. Seven cried out to Cypress, That love is a part of all of us now. I can sense it if I don't try. Trying makes it difficult, because it's there all of the time. It's always here. Seven smiled incredulously. Or there. Anyhow, it's everywhere, and it couches and protects the very heart of our beings. So it's all right. Everything's all right and always
has been.
And Cypress answered, What have I been telling you? Seven said aloud to George and Gregory Diggs, I have to go now, or pretty soon at least. But even if you don't see me, I'll be around, and in a way I'll be a part of each of you. He felt inside his consciousness and saw Josephine driving more quickly than she should have down the dark streets toward George's house. Do take life easier, he said gently to her. You're accomplishing more than you realize. And as he told the others,
Everything really is all right.
Seven sensed the night air and the smell of lilacs, and knew that Josephine was pulling into the backyard below. He whispered goodbye
Once again.
And Josephine smiled to herself and drove up to George's garage. She straightened her dress as she got out of the car. Seven felt a catch in his physical throat. He said to George, I sort of liked this physical body. The eyes and hands and hair, the ears and all, fit me really well. But I don't really belong here this way, you know. And I think, George, you've always known that in a way. I wish you all the very best of luck, but I'm afraid you won't remember me. Not consciously. I'll be around anyway. Seven looked at all of them and grinned the best, gayest smile he could conjure up. Cypress said gently, It's time now, Seven. They won't remember, but they will. Won't remember what? Asked George. What? Asked Gregory Diggs. Gee, I don't know, George replied. I just had the feeling that something important had come and gone, yet not gone, and don't ask me what the hell I mean by that. Tiny rays of light glittered and sparkled high in the upper corners of the room, and moved to the window-sill and outside the window-sill. They danced and gyrated in the transparent air. Then they disappeared. What's next? Seven asked Cypress. Who knows? She answered. Do you know? I know. And you know. And all of your personalities really know, Cypress said in the sweetest, clearest mental voice imaginable. And Seven said, I know, or I almost know. He grinned and waited to see what would happen next. That is the end of OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts. Thank you. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.